Today on History's Tech, we are looking at the Martin B-26 Marauder. And while it shares an almost similar designation to the Douglas A-26 Invader, which at one time was the B-26, it is an aircraft all on its own. But let's go ahead and look at the history of the B-26 Marauder. Now, the B-26 is the brainchild of the Glenn L. Martin Company, who submitted a design to new Army specifications based on Proposal 39640. And this was a request for a twin-engine medium bomber with a 2,000-pound bomb load, a max speed of 350 miles per hour, and a 3,000-mile range. And the Martin Company went ahead and decided to submit this design here, known as the Martin Model 179. Now, the Martin Model 179 was not the only one in the competition. It was actually up against this, the North American NA-40. Now, when the Army actually evaluated both of these aircraft, they found that they liked the 179 better than the NA-40. But they did like both aircraft. So the Army went ahead and put in an order for both of these, with the 179 being the main part of the purchase and calling this aircraft the B-26 and the other aircraft the B-25. So the Army went ahead and ordered 201 of the B-26s, and even before the aircraft's first flight, they decided to order another 930. And this is kind of where the problem is going to begin with the B-26, because during the initial testing of the aircraft, it was found that the aircraft could only safely take off and land at high speeds, and that if you went below roughly about 120 to 130 miles per hour, the aircraft had a tendency to crash. Now, the reason for this is essentially due to the fact that because it had such a small wing area, and this resulted in a high wing loading, they required a high-speed landing. Now, if you went below that speed, you ended up stalling the aircraft, and combine that with improper weight distribution for an aircraft of this size, you got what was basically a disaster situation waiting to happen, thus earning this aircraft the nickname the Widowmaker. Add to this, the uniqueness of the aircraft meant that pilots typically had to be specifically trained to pilot it. When an inexperienced pilot was placed into this aircraft, the accident rates typically went up. So at this point, the Army had a bad reputation aircraft. It could have abandoned it. Instead, it chose to begin retraining the pilots. It also brought in expert pilots, such as Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, to demonstrate that the aircraft was fully capable of doing more than what people thought they could. And then the Army goes in and brings in the Women Air Force Service pilots and actually puts together a B-26 demonstration team in order to basically shame male pilots into flying the aircraft. Now, they didn't do all this work for no reason. The Army did go in and start retraining pilots to learn how to properly utilize the aircraft, and over time they did make quite a few improvements overall, the wing edges, tail improvements, things like that, in order to make it a much more stable aircraft. Now, it wasn't long after the first flight that the aircraft started to see its earliest deployments. In February of 1941, the 22nd Bombardment Group got the first shipment of B-26s, replacing their Douglas B-18s. And right after the Pearl Harbor attacks was really when we start to see the first overseas deployment of them. They follow the 22nd Bomb Group as they begin their early attacks against the Japanese into 1942, where they were actually attached to Midway Island as part of the buildup for the Battle of Midway, and they would actually be utilized in an attack on the aircraft carrier Kagi. And after that, they would see limited action in the Pacific theater until they were phased out in 1943 in favor of the North American B-25 Mitchell. From there, they would be utilized in the Mediterranean theater, especially part of the Allied invasion of French North Africa, where they were initially used to carry out low-level attacks, but it was discovered that this was a bad idea, and the aircraft took heavy losses during these attacks, and they were switched to medium-level bombing attacks instead. And while they managed to fly over 1,500 sorties during this campaign, they end up losing about 80 aircraft, and this was double the loss rate for the B-25, that also flew 70% more sorties with fewer aircraft. So the reputation is not going great at this point for the B-26. From there, it would be finally deployed in the European theater in 1943, where it was once again unsuccessfully utilized as a low-level attack aircraft. However, the British decided to switch tactics and utilize the aircraft as a medium altitude operation aircraft. And it was found that when utilizing the aircraft around roughly 10 to 15,000 feet with appropriate fighter escort, it was an extremely effective aircraft. And it was actually extremely accurate, proceeding to be one of the most accurate bombers of the war. And after this switch in tactics, the loss rate went to less than 1% for the rest of the war, giving it one of the best bomber records for the Allies. The aircraft would be utilized from there to attack multiple targets, including bridges, V-1 launch sites. It would take place during the D-Day invasion and be one of the most accurate bombers of D-Day. And under the British, its reputation continued to grow. While being utilized by the British, it was a very successful torpedo bomber, being utilized to take out multiple merchant ships in the Mediterranean. And even with all this success towards the end of the war, the aircraft was essentially finished by 1945, with the last units disbanding them in 1946, with the very last military to utilize it being the French Air Force, which used it until 1958 to test jet engines. Now, because of the multiple improvements made to the aircraft and basically to improve its capability, the aircraft has quite a few variants, with most of them being small modifications, such as the B-26B, which by itself has about 6 different variants under the B designation. However, there are a couple of unique ones, such as the XB-26H, which tested a tandem landing gear setup, basically meaning it had a bicycle landing gear, large wheel in the front, large wheel in the back, and then 2 side wheels. And this was actually a test platform for what would later become the Martin XB-48 bomber. The United States Navy had its own version known as the JM-1P, which was a photo reconnaissance variant. And just like the A-26, the B-26 after the war saw several of them being converted into high-speed executive transports. But one of the most interesting, what technically wouldn't have been a variant, it would have been a continuation of the B-26, was going to be an aircraft known as the Martin XB-33. Also known as the Super Marauder, was basically a improved version of the B-26. It utilized a twin tail now, similar to the B-25, new larger engines, a pressurized crew compartment, and even a doubled bomb load capability. However, basically, Martin realized the aircraft wasn't going to cut it. It was going to be too slow. It wouldn't meet any of the Army's requirements. And so they just abandoned the design, kinda. And they basically came back with a new design known as the XB-33A. And this was an improved version of the B-26. It was now 4-engine. The Army actually liked the design and they wanted to put it up against the B-24 and the B-17 to see kind of a comparison of what it could do, because theoretically it could have had a 12,000-pound bomb load, making it the heaviest bomber flown in combat prior to the B-29. However, the design was essentially abandoned in favor of the already ready-to-be-produced B-29. Now, even with over 5,000 aircraft produced, because of its relatively short career, most of the aircraft ended up being destroyed over time, and there's only a handful in existence to this day, one in France, a handful in the United States. But there you have it, a look at the B-26 Marauder, an aircraft that had an absolutely horrible reputation during its early days, and the United States Army Air Force had to go through a lot of work to get people to like the aircraft, and by the end of the war, it really showed its reputation as a great medium altitude bomber that was extremely accurate. It just came at the wrong time and had too good of a competition to really go beyond that. But that's it for today. I thank you for joining me. I look forward to talking to you on the next time.